CME Group has filed to launch futures contracts tied to Cardano, Chainlink, and Stellar Lumens, subject to regulatory review. The proposed launch window places these contracts alongside CME's existing crypto derivatives, which already include Bitcoin, Ethereum, and a small number of other digital assets. On its face, this looks like a routine product expansion. In practice, CME does not list instruments casually, and it does not create derivatives markets for assets that lack sustained institutional demand, legal clarity, or operational relevance. The significance of this development is not directional or promotional. It lies in what must already be true inside financial markets for this filing to exist at all. CME is a derivatives exchange. That sounds obvious, but it's worth being precise about what that actually implies. CME does not exist to evaluate technologies, forecast adoption curves, or speculate on future narratives. Its role is narrower and more mechanical. It provides standardized financial instruments when large participants need a reliable way to price risk, transfer exposure, or reconcile positions across fragmented markets. Every product on CME reflects a problem that already exists elsewhere in the financial system. That framing is important because futures contracts are not aspirational products. They are not launched to encourage participation or to test interest. They are launched when interest is already present but inefficiently expressed. Futures emerge when exposure exists in forms that are difficult to hedge, difficult to value consistently, or operationally awkward to manage across counterparties. CME's involvement usually means that enough institutions have reached that point independently for the exchange to justify stepping in. When CME lists a futures contract tied to an asset, it is responding to observable behavior, not hypothetical demand. That behavior does not have to look like speculative trading. In many cases, it doesn't. Exposure can arise through custody arrangements, structured notes, index products, client-driven flow, or internal treasury positions that are secondary to some other business activity. In digital assets, exposure increasingly comes from operational usage rather than directional bets. Payments, data feeds, settlement logic, and tokenized instruments all create balance sheet and counterparty considerations even when price appreciation is not the primary objective. This is why the presence of futures markets should be understood as a consequence rather than a catalyst. CME is not introducing Cardano, Chainlink, or Stellar to institutions. Institutions have already found themselves interacting with these networks in ways that create measurable financial exposure. CME is formalizing that reality by offering a standardized mechanism to hedge, offset, or neutralize it. The distinction matters because it reframes the entire event. Without that context, it's easy to interpret the filing as an endorsement or a bet. In reality, it is closer to an admission that informal solutions are no longer sufficient. At a certain scale, bespoke hedging arrangements, bilateral agreements, or off-exchange workarounds become inefficient. They introduce basis risk, settlement risk, and compliance complexity. Futures contracts exist to reduce those frictions by centralizing price discovery and margining under a regulated framework. This also explains why the operational and regulatory cost of launching a new futures product is a meaningful signal. CME does not absorb that cost lightly. New contracts require coordination with regulators, clearing members, market makers, and internal risk systems. Liquidity must be seeded. Margin models must be calibrated. Surveillance systems must be updated. None of that happens unless CME believes the underlying demand is durable rather than transient. Timing in this context is a lagging indicator. Futures markets tend to appear after an asset class has already been partially normalized inside institutional workflows. Before a contract is listed, internal risk teams have usually debated the asset's behavior, compliance departments have developed provisional frameworks, and counterparties have begun to treat it as something that needs formal oversight rather than ad hoc handling. By the time CME files, the question is rarely whether exposure exists. The question is whether it has reached a level where standardization is the least bad option. That is why futures markets should be viewed as mid to late stage infrastructure. They do not mark the beginning of institutional engagement. They mark the point at which engagement has become sufficiently routine that it needs to be systematized. In that sense, CME's move is less about expanding into new territory and more about consolidating activity that was already happening in less visible, less efficient ways. Seen through that lens, the listing of futures tied to ADA, Link, and XLM is not surprising. It suggests that exposure to these networks has crossed an internal threshold where ignoring it creates more risk than formalizing it. CME's role is not to validate that exposure, but to make it manageable. Cardano, Chainlink, and Stellar appear together here, not because they share a narrative, a user base, or a market cycle, but because they solve different problems that institutions increasingly encounter as digital assets move from experimentation into operational use. From a market structure perspective, they occupy separate functional layers. Treating them as interchangeable altcoins obscures why they would be grouped by a derivatives exchange in the first place. Cardano belongs to the category of base-layer settlement networks where governance design and system behavior are treated as first-order considerations. Its development approach emphasizes formal verification, slow iteration, and clearly defined upgrade processes. That approach is often criticized in retail discussions for limiting speed or flexibility, but those critiques miss how institutional risk is assessed. Predictability matters more than velocity when exposure is measured across long time horizons and subject to internal controls. A system that behaves consistently under stress, and whose governance mechanisms can be modeled rather than inferred, is easier to integrate into risk frameworks. In that context, Cardano's relevance is not about developer excitement or short-term throughput, but about whether the network's behavior can be anticipated with a high degree of confidence. That confidence becomes particularly important when governance risk itself is treated as a financial variable. Institutions do not assume that protocol governance is neutral. They attempt to account for it. Networks with opaque or rapidly shifting governance structures introduce uncertainty that is difficult to hedge. Cardano's design choices reduce that uncertainty, even if they do so at the cost of rapid experimentation. From the perspective of a derivatives market, that trade-off is often acceptable. Chainlink occupies a fundamentally different position. It is not a settlement layer and it is not primarily a venue for value transfer. It functions as middleware, supplying external data and enabling interoperability between systems that cannot natively communicate. In many cases, institutions are exposed to Chainlink without explicitly holding it as a speculative asset. Exposure arises because pricing models, settlement conditions, collateral thresholds, or automated actions depend on Chainlink-provided data. When that data feed becomes integral to financial logic, its reliability and continuity become sources of risk. This type of embedded exposure is easy to overlook because it does not show up cleanly on balance sheets. It shows up operationally. If a pricing feed fails, deviates, or behaves unexpectedly, the downstream impact can be financial even if no one intended to speculate on the underlying token. As these dependencies grow, so does the need to hedge or offset the risk associated with them. A futures contract does not solve every operational risk, but it provides a standardized way to manage price exposure tied to that dependency. That is often sufficient to justify its existence. Stellar, meanwhile, is oriented toward payments, issuance, and regulated value transfer. Its architecture is designed to interface with existing financial systems rather than replace them outright. That makes it relevant in contexts involving cross-border settlement, tokenized assets, and stablecoin issuance, particularly where compliance and integration with traditional rails are required. In these environments, exposure is frequently a byproduct of usage. Institutions using Stellar-based rails for settlement or issuance may accumulate balances, liquidity obligations, or counterparty relationships that carry financial risk even when price appreciation is not the objective. Operational exposure of this kind creates a different hedging profile than speculative trading. It tends to be persistent, low visibility, and tied to business processes rather than market sentiment. Futures contracts are well suited to that profile because they allow exposure to be neutralized without unwinding the underlying operational activity. That makes them useful even when volumes appear modest or when the asset is not a focal point of trading strategies. When viewed together, Cardano, Chainlink, and Stellar align with three distinct functions: settlement, data, and transfer. These are not overlapping roles. They are complementary components that increasingly appear in the same institutional workflows as tokenization, automation, and digital settlement mature. CME's selection reflects that reality. It suggests an attempt to provide coverage across different points of the digital asset infrastructure stack rather than to follow popularity or short-term interest. In that sense, the grouping is less about the assets themselves and more about how exposure to them manifests. CME is responding to the way institutions actually encounter these networks in practice, often indirectly and for reasons unrelated to speculation. The futures contracts formalize that exposure by giving it a standardized financial expression. The introduction of futures markets does not mechanically translate into higher prices, and assuming that it does reflects a misunderstanding of what futures are designed to do. Futures contracts exist to make markets more complete, not more enthusiastic. They expand the set of possible strategies by allowing participants to express both long and short views, to arbitrage discrepancies across venues, and to manage exposure without transacting in the underlying asset directly. Over time, this tends to compress narrative-driven volatility rather than amplify it. One of the immediate effects of a mature futures market is the erosion of one-sided positioning. When short exposure is expensive or unavailable, price movements can be driven disproportionately by sentiment and momentum. Futures introduce counterweights. Professional market makers can hedge inventory dynamically, exploit basis differences, and profit from spreads rather than directional moves. That behavior improves price discovery and reduces the likelihood of extreme dislocations caused by thin liquidity or reflexive buying. The result is often a market that trades within tighter ranges and reacts more to fundamental flows than to stories. For institutional capital, that shift is not a negative outcome. Institutions generally do not seek volatility for its own sake. They seek environments where risk can be measured, priced, and offset with reasonable confidence. Futures markets make that possible by providing standardized contracts, transparent margining, and centralized clearing. Without those tools, exposure must be held naked or managed through bespoke arrangements that introduce operational and counterparty risk. From that perspective, the absence of futures markets is not a bullish condition. It is a constraint that limits participation to actors willing or able to tolerate unmanaged risk. This distinction explains why futures markets often precede broader institutional engagement rather than follow it. Large pools of capital are structurally unable to deploy into environments where risk cannot be hedged. Even when an asset is attractive from a strategic or operational standpoint, the inability to offset price exposure can make participation impractical. Futures remove that barrier. They do not compel capital to enter, but they make entry possible on terms that align with regulatory and fiduciary obligations. For asset holders, this dynamic can be counterintuitive. Futures are sometimes framed as catalysts for upside, but their more reliable effect is normalization. As markets mature, pricing becomes less sensitive to retail-driven narratives and more responsive to flows, hedging activity, and cross-market relationships. Funding distortions tend to narrow. Liquidity deepens. Volatility becomes more symmetric. These changes are subtle and unfold over time, which is why they are often misinterpreted or dismissed when viewed through a short-term lens. The real impact of futures markets is structural rather than immediate. They change who can participate, how positions are managed, and how stress propagates through the system. They allow markets to absorb shocks without breaking and to function during periods of uncertainty without relying on discretionary intervention. That is the context in which CME's role should be understood. The exchange is not attempting to catalyze rallies or validate narratives. It is building infrastructure designed to hold up under pressure, even when sentiment turns negative. Recognizing that distinction is essential to interpreting developments like this one. Futures markets are not signals of optimism. They are mechanisms of control. They do not tell you where price is going next. They tell you that the market is being prepared to operate in a more disciplined and resilient way. CME operates inside one of the most tightly regulated segments of global financial markets. Every new contract it introduces must fit within an existing regulatory framework that governs clearing, margining, surveillance, and counterparty risk. That framework leaves little room for ambiguity. While regulatory approval is not automatic and should not be assumed, The act of filing itself reflects a level of internal confidence that the underlying assets can be situated within known legal and risk categories. This distinction is important because regulatory interaction at this level is not speculative. CME does not approach regulators with unresolved questions about whether an asset is fundamentally permissible. Those conversations happen long before a filing is made. By the time a product proposal reaches the public stage, the more basic issues of classification and risk treatment have already been addressed internally. What remains is procedural review rather than conceptual uncertainty. This does not imply that regulators endorse Cardano, Chainlink, or Stellar as technologies, investment opportunities, or policy priorities. Regulatory bodies do not operate that way. What it suggests is something narrower but more consequential. These assets are increasingly treated as manageable financial instruments rather than unresolved legal edge cases. They can be analyzed, categorized, and supervised using existing tools. That alone differentiates them from a large portion of the digital asset universe. The uneven nature of this shift is often overlooked. Many digital tokens remain unsuitable for regulated derivatives precisely because they fail one or more basic tests. Their governance structures may be opaque or highly discretionary. Their distribution histories may raise unresolved questions about issuance and control. Their economic behavior may be too unstable or too closely tied to promotional activity to support standardized risk models. In those cases, uncertainty is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a structural barrier. The fact that ADA, Link, and XLM have cleared CME's internal thresholds indicates that they are no longer viewed through that lens. It suggests that their legal treatment, governance characteristics, and market behavior are sufficiently well understood to be incorporated into a regulated derivatives framework. That does not make them risk-free, but it makes them legible. For regulators and exchanges alike, legibility is a prerequisite for inclusion. This form of acceptance is quiet and incremental. It does not come with press conferences or sweeping declarations. It manifests through permissions granted, products approved, and constraints defined. In financial markets, those signals often matter more than public rhetoric because they determine who is allowed to engage and on what terms. A regulated futures contract expands the set of participants who can interact with an asset while narrowing the range of behaviors that are acceptable. Seen in that light, CME's filing is less about regulatory triumph and more about regulatory normalization. It reflects a stage where oversight shifts from questioning whether an asset belongs in the system to deciding how it should be managed within it. That transition is slow, technical, and easy to underestimate, but it is one of the clearest indicators that an asset has moved beyond the margins of the financial landscape. Most reactions to developments like this tend to cluster around two familiar extremes. One group interprets the filing as a directional signal and looks for immediate confirmation in price. Another group dismisses it as procedural noise, assuming that anything without short-term market impact is irrelevant. Both responses are shaped more by expectation than by analysis, and both miss the way structural changes actually propagate through financial markets. This misreading is common because market participants are conditioned to look for visible effects. Price moves are easy to observe and easy to argue about. Structural shifts are not. They alter the conditions under which markets operate rather than producing discrete events that can be pointed to in isolation. Futures markets fall squarely into that category. Their influence is diffuse and cumulative, expressed through changes in behavior rather than through single moments of repricing. Over longer time horizons, the presence of a futures market affects how assets are treated inside institutional systems. Risk models are adjusted to incorporate hedging availability. Liquidity assumptions change as market makers factor in new arbitrage paths. Correlations begin to evolve as assets become more tightly linked to broader macro and cross-asset dynamics. These are second-order effects, and they rarely register in the immediate aftermath of a product launch. Periods of market stress are often where these changes become most apparent. Assets with established derivatives markets tend to exhibit different liquidity profiles when volatility rises. Bid-ask spreads behave differently. Forced selling propagates differently. Hedging flows interact with spot markets in ways that dampen or redirect pressure. None of this is obvious when conditions are calm, which is why the significance of futures markets is easy to underestimate until they are tested. Another reason these developments are misread is that they do not align neatly with narrative cycles. By the time futures markets are introduced, the underlying story has often already peaked. Attention has shifted elsewhere. As a result, the structural implications unfold in the background, without a clear narrative hook to anchor them. Observers who rely on headlines or short-term signals are left with the impression that nothing happened. In reality, the effects accumulate quietly. Market participation broadens incrementally. Volatility patterns change subtly. Pricing becomes more responsive to flows than to sentiment. These changes are difficult to reverse precisely because they are not the result of a single decision or announcement. They emerge from the interaction of new instruments with existing market behavior, and once those interactions are normalized, they become part of the baseline. By the time the presence of futures markets feels unremarkable, their influence has already been absorbed into how the asset trades and how it is perceived by different classes of participants. That is the point at which they stop being noticed altogether. Developments that follow this pattern rarely attract sustained attention at the moment they occur, but they shape outcomes long after the initial reaction has faded. CME's move to list futures tied to Cardano, Chainlink, and Stellar is not a signal about price and not an endorsement of any particular vision for crypto. It is a response to existing institutional interaction with these systems and a recognition that exposure has reached a level where standardized risk management tools are required. The significance lies in normalization, not excitement. For those paying attention to market structure rather than headlines, that distinction makes all the difference.